Welcome to Mystic Realms Recap. Links are in the description below. Please show some love of the author and me. On to the show. President Felix, according to the Paparug's theorem, your formula is really impossible. If you don't believe it, we can get you a book on pharmacy theory. Wilkinson hurried forward in a bid to persuade him. Someone pulled Wilkinson away, and softly told him, "Wilkinson, just ignore him and let him go ahead. We'll see what he can come up with." None of the pharmacists liked Lin Li, and everyone wanted to see him suffer the effects of the potion. Well, it wouldn't kill anyway. Wilkinson stopped talking, and the young pharmacists looked at the stage with anticipation, watching as Lin Li prepared the potion step by step. They were waiting to cheer and vent their frustration once he made a fool out of himself. However, reality disappointed everyone and took them by shock. What seemed to be a trap at first was actually completed easily. There was no accident, and Lin Li mixed the liquids together according to the instructions of the formula. Of course, it came as a great shock to the pharmacists. After recovering from the shock, Wilkinson immediately sensed that something was amiss. He could not understand why the pharmaceutical theorem that he was extremely familiar with turned out to be wrong. After giving it some careful thought, he tried to recall what Lin Li did during the most crucial step. Thick white vapor wafted up into the air, and soon, some earthy yellow powder appeared in Lin Li's cup. It was the modified bone erosion powder. He raised the glass in his hand, and said, "This is the potion I want you to formulate. Who else here still thinks that the formula is fake?" Silence filled the room. The young pharmacists could not believe their eyes at all, because the theories that they had been familiar with were defied at this moment. Impossible. This is a clear violation of the Paparug's theorem. How can it really be possible to realize this formula? Everyone felt the same. Fine, I've already proved the feasibility of the formula. I won't force you to leave or stay, but don't act like I bullied you lest President Balba gets the wrong idea. Lin Li placed the cup on the table and looked at everyone in disdain. Although the pharmacists were young and full of vigor, the truth was still clear as day. The so-called trap was there just because of their own incompetence. After being despised, they were obviously too ashamed to air their displeasure again. Wilkinson knew that it was time for him to stand up and make his stand. He coughed awkwardly, and said, "President Felix, I'm sorry. We misunderstood you. However, can you explain to us why the Paparug's theorem is not applicable in this formula? Otherwise, we really can't successfully formulate this potion." Since Wilkinson had already swallowed his pride and admitted to their mistake, Lin Li decided to forgive them after seeing how sincere Wilkinson was. After all, Lin Li was not an unreasonable person. He nodded, and said, "The so-called theorem is the summation of previous experience of others who had been testing it through generations. In the process of this verification, some of these theories have been passed down, and some have been overturned because of some new discoveries. Therefore, the theorem is not the definite truth, and it may not necessarily be absolutely correct or wrong. Perhaps the discoveries necessary to prove it wrong just haven't been published yet. As for why the Paparug's theorem is invalid for this formula, it's because of the change in medicinal properties," Lin Li said while pointing at Wilkinson and the rest, who were now awestruck. They returned to their seats quietly and listened like they usually would during Teacher Balba's lessons, afraid that they would miss a single word. However, it was all just elementary knowledge, after all. Just like magic that became worthless after it was cracked, there was nothing too strange about the Paparug's theorem being untrue after Lin Li explained it. Well, at least that was the case for the mages. Turns out it's so simple. I thought that there was something miraculous and unfathomable about it. So I just didn't expect it. They were unwilling to believe that the president of the Guild of Magic, who was younger than them, would surpass them in pharmacy. It was actually a normal mentality. Whenever humans encountered something that they couldn't believe, they would always try to explain it using their own concepts until they could finally accept it, just like those who liked to crack magic tricks. Lin Li stood on the stage, where he could clearly see that the young pharmacists under the stage were experiencing variations in their expressions while they listened to his explanation. However, he didn't pay much attention, for these pharmacists were not his actual students, anyway. Lin Li stopped after talking about what he ought to, not planning to say anything more. He knew that if he spoke too much and if there was something that contradicted the theory that they were familiar with, he would not have the patience to persuade them. The main problem was that Lin Li had no idea what the pharmacists didn't know. Since he was in Amril, he had not actually studied pharmacy, and his own pharmaceutical knowledge was obtained through the Scroll of Wishes. The incident happened this time because he hadn't considered the fact that the Paparug's theorem was still regarded as true by these people, though it had long been overthrown, for as long as he could remember. Wilkinson and other pharmacists did not mention the matter of going back to Alana anymore, and Lin Li left the room. Instead, they obediently began to prepare the potion using the skills that they had newly learned. They didn't have another choice. Since the formula was real, they didn't have an excuse to report to President Balba. During the preparation of the potion, the topic of their discussion was undoubtedly Lin Li, the young president who took them by surprise, especially with his knowledge in pharmaceutics. Unfortunately, Lin Li's performance was not an indicative factor of his level in pharmaceutics. After all, the bone erosion powder was just a low-level potion. Even if he knows techniques that defy the laws of the Paparug's theorem, that can't show what his level is. I'm sure you know that the technique is not complicated. It just didn't come to mind at first. But, even we, the geniuses of the Pharmaceutics Guild, didn't think of it. Yeah, the masters didn't think of it, either, but that can't prove that he's superior to them. I bet he's just a low-level pharmacist. I can tell that he has a strong foundation. Perhaps he might already be an intermediate pharmacist. Wilkinson, what do you think? After hearing his peer's question, Wilkinson calmly answered, has none of you thought about the reason we're here? Does he actually want us to learn about pharmaceutics from him? What a joke, a low-level pharmacist said in disbelief. Wilkinson shook his head gently, and said, although this technique is inconspicuous, it can overthrow Paparug's theorem, and no one in our guild knew about this. How did this President Felix even find out? Clearly, there must be a knowledgeable pharmacist behind President Felix. After hearing Wilkinson's speculation, the crowd suddenly felt enlightened, and everything seemed to make sense. It turned out that Master Balba did not actually banish them, and instead just wanted to let them learn from pharmacists outside the guild. Obviously, President Felix was the disciple of the unknown master, but he was more inclined towards learning magic, and so his master had to have asked him to find some disciples. Humans had unlimited imagination, and the pharmacists began to speculate after receiving Wilkinson's prompts. However, none of them mentioned returning to Alana again. They decided to stay of their own accord, and not because of Balba's pressurizing them. Even if someone wanted to drive them away now, they would not leave. For the next 2 days, they continuously tried to guess the identity of the mysterious man behind Lin Li. However, the mysterious pharmaceutics guru had never appeared before, and they were all just making wild guesses. Hence, they were all actively discussing Lin Li. However, they no longer felt so resentful towards him after finding out that they had not been exiled and were not there for an unethical transaction. Even an untalented person would improve greatly with the guidance of a pharmaceutics guru. They could tell from the 2 demonstrations that Lin Li had performed that he had a good foundation in pharmaceutics. However, the young President Felix had only turned 20 years old, and although they were all young people, the true pharmacists were mostly in their 30s and older than him. Besides, they also knew that he was extremely talented in magic. Although he was only 20 years old, he had already reached the legendary realm. No one was invincible, and even talented individuals had their limits. Since he had made such a remarkable achievement, it meant that he had put in plenty of effort into learning magic. Since he was a genius in magic and pharmaceutics, he was one of a kind. Even the powerhouses who had stepped into the legendary realm would only have time to learn pharmaceutics after their lifespan increased with that breakthrough. The pharmacists felt that he was an absolute genius, for he was an expert in both pharmaceutics and magic at the age of 20. Lin Li had no idea that he had given the pharmacists something to talk about. He thought they should be honored that he was helping them. With so many pharmacists working together, they should soon be able to prepare a sufficient amount of weakened bone erosion powder. Although most of the 35 pharmacists were low-level ones, they were all excellent talents of the Pharmacist Guild, after all. It should be a piece of cake for them to prepare low-level potions. Over the next 2 days, the pharmacists who had gotten familiar with the preparation of the potion worked extremely hard, which was much to Lin Li's pleasure. The medicinal materials that he had prepared beforehand were depleted rapidly, and the room was soon filled with the finished product. Lin Li was not intending to sell the bone erosion powder, so he just had to make enough for the magic gears in Black Cloud's town. He had also prepared to use a few other poisons in the magic gears. Thus, he got ready to provide a new formula for pharmacists to prepare now that they had already gotten enough bone erosion powder. He decided to proceed with teaching them after all the potions required for Black Cloud's town were ready. Upon hearing Lin Li's words, everyone's faces remained silent. In their opinion, he was just spouting nonsense and making excuses. They knew without a doubt that President Balba would definitely not spare them. Lin Li obviously wouldn't be bothered whatever they thought. He came up with the training plan because he didn't want to owe Balba a favor. Hence, it did not matter who the training candidates were. Even if they were middle-aged pharmacists who were not advanced in level, he would still be confident in helping them improve as long as they were not fools. However, Lin Li was not obliged to shield them and allow them to use him to explain their premature return to Balba, either. Hence, he said, "Didn't you guys say that I was making a fool out of you guys with a fake formula? Didn't you say that this was impossible? Watch carefully what happens next. Geniuses of the Pharmacist Guild? They're all so ignorant." Lin Li's method was simple, and he decided not to talk much. Since they'd decided to bring in some pharmaceutics jargon and theories, and insisted that his formula was not feasible, he decided to give them an eye-opener. Wilkinson and others had witnessed the young mage skillfully formulate the antidote with his own hands. However, they could tell from the process that it was just a basic, low-level potion. It could only mean that he had a certain foundation in pharmaceutics. However, it seemed now that Lin Li was really going to begin preparing the potion that they, the geniuses of the Pharmacist Guild, could not. Wilkinson and the rest found it to be extremely incredible. Could this young president of the Guild of Magic really be a pharmacist? However, Wilkinson quickly snapped out of his thoughts, thinking that Lin Li and his teacher Balba had some relations, after all. Even if he disliked his personality, he couldn't let Lin Li suffer an accident. Just as Lin Li was about to enter the pharmaceutical room, he heard the sounds of an argument coming from inside. After listening carefully, he discovered that the pharmacists seemed to be having a heated argument about the concoction of a potion. He pushed the door and entered. However, they were all still crowding around each other and debating about the problem in 2 separate groups. None of them noticed Lin Li's presence at all. Lin Li stood by the side to listen to their argument carefully for a while. He finally realized the reason for their argument. It turned out that they were discussing modifying advanced potions to weaken them after witnessing the effects of the modified bone erosion powder. Actually, the concoction of advanced potions was not a fresh topic, and was easy to understand too. Right from the beginning of the concoction process of an advanced potion, one would have to collect and prepare all of the necessary materials, which were hard to find, for they ranged from extinct plants to menacing beasts. In order to acquire them, one would have to pay a hefty price. Those who couldn't find the required medicinal materials, but wanted to obtain the effects of a specific potion, could replace the missing medicinal materials with other common ones. In fact, examples of successful weakening of advanced pharmaceuticals did occur amongst thousands of pharmaceutical formulations, but the number was pathetically small. The medicinal properties of various medicinal materials changed infinitely, and were subject to the effects of varying temperature and differences in different medicinal properties during the preparation of pharmaceuticals. If one did not grasp the changes in the medicinal properties of various medicinal materials when formulating potions, there would be no way to find any alternatives. Perhaps one might think at first that a common medicinal material was weaker than the precious medicinal material. However, when one added the common medicinal material during the preparation, it was likely that it'd change in appearance, resulting in unexpected changes. Throughout the history of pharmaceutics, there had been plenty of pharmacists who had lost their lives while concocting and researching advanced potions. At some point, some even thought that modifications could never be made to advanced potions to weaken them, because the changes of advanced potions were far too unpredictable, just like lottery. No one would know the winning numbers. Of course, the pharmacists here were just low-level and intermediate ones, who wouldn't actually discuss the concoction of an advanced potion. They were just discussing a low-level one. It was not that they were bored, but rather that they felt that the discussion process would help them gain a better understanding of pharmaceutics. They were discussing a low-level potion, the insight of the owl, that would mainly heighten one's observation and visual senses. Since mages had the wizard's eye, they didn't need such a potion. However, the potion would be very beneficial for archers. The main ingredient of that potion was known as the dragon's eye, though it was not actually an eye of a dragon, and was actually an extremely rare plant that grew on peaks. The young pharmacists were also discussing what kind of low-grade medicinal herbs they could use to replace it. One of them suggested that they use bitter fruit to replace it, while another suggested the eye of the skylark. Both of them were intermediate pharmacists, and neither of them could convince the other. They both turned hot and angry while arguing with each other. Actually, there are problems with both. A voice that sounded exceptionally clear amidst the argument suddenly filled the air. The two of them quickly looked over as they fell silent, only to see the young mage called President Felic. Although the pharmacists no longer treated Lin Li like an amateur after the concoction of bone erosion powder, they guessed that Lin Li was at most a low-level pharmacist even though he had a mysterious pharmaceutics guru as his master. President Felic, we're talking about the formulation of a weakened intermediate-level potion. Stop being unreasonable, one of the pharmacists said smilingly in a hostile manner, though he did not have any ill intentions. Actually, Balba had put in plenty of effort into sending them there for the training program. He knew what Lin Li's temper was like, and hence decided to send these young pharmacists who were not too arrogant and complacent even though they were outstanding talents of the pharmacist guild. Lin Li smiled and ignored his mockery. Slowly and calmly, he continued, we'll start from the results first. Between bitter fruit and the eye of the skylark, bitter fruit is closer to the dragon's eye. However, there is a bitter element in bitter fruit that makes the inside of the owl. After the dragon's eye was replaced, there had to be further replacements of other materials because of the change and the reactions. Upon hearing Lin Li's explanation, everyone was dumbfounded. One would have to be very knowledgeable in pharmaceutical formulas in order to come up with such a detailed and accurate analysis that could not be made by a low-level pharmacist. This world was crazy. How could someone be able to do so much? President Felic, so you mean these two ingredients cannot be used to replace the dragon's eye at all? Do you have a better choice, then? Or is it that the owl's insight can't be weakened at all? One of the intermediate pharmacists asked indignantly. I said that bitter fruit is actually very suitable for replacing dragon's eye to produce the same effect, but the substitution cannot be achieved because of the arbutin in it. However, there is a kind of green worm in the bitter fruit tree that feeds on bitter fruit. Arbutin will be broken down in its body while the other components are absorbed. You mean, we should use those worms to replace the dragon's eye? Some people asked in apprehension. Do you not believe me? Well, there is a bitter fruit forest that is not too far to the north from the Tower of Dusk. Why don't you guys go catch some green worms and try using them for your concoctions? Lin Li said confidently. The pharmacists were all young people who had no reason to turn Lin Li's suggestion down, be it because of the fact that pharmacists ought to be passionate about learning or the curiosity of youths. Lin Li then headed to the podium of the room and erased the bone erosion powder formula on the blackboard before writing down a new formula carefully on the side. He said to Wilkinson and the rest, although the formula for devouring mist is harder than the previous one, it's still considered a low-level potion. Familiarize yourselves with it and raise any questions that you have. Don't mistake it for a fake formula again. After hearing Lin Li's words, Wilkinson and the other pharmacists could not help but feel embarrassed because of the things that happened before. In order to avoid causing such a problem again, they decided to analyze the formula carefully and discuss it, even though they were all feeling eager to start concocting. Just as they were analyzing the new formula, someone returned with some fat green worms. Lin Li did not bother being too polite, and instead gathered all of the materials for the owl's insight and began concocting the potion while everyone else watched in anticipation. With Lin Li's current abilities, concocting the original version of the owl's insight would be a piece of cake for him, let alone a modified version. The pharmacists watched in awe as the young President Felix mixed the chemicals with finesse, as if they were watching an art exhibition. He was showcasing his incredible abilities in pharmaceutics. After placing the concocted potion on the table, Lin Li clapped gently, and said, "All right, it's done. I'll leave the potion here. Anyone who's interested may come forth to take a look." He then turned around and left the room, leaving them behind. The potion was proven to be effective, and the concoction of the weakened version was also accurate. Once again, they began to discuss and speculate about Lin Li's level of knowledge in pharmaceutics. They could not take it any longer. Not only was he a legendary mage, he had also achieved the level of an intermediate pharmacist at least, which was absolutely incredible. Was he a senior pharmacist? Only a lunatic would assume so. The young mage and president was only 20 years old. A long while later, they finally recovered from the shock. Staring at the formula written on the blackboard, Wilkinson exclaimed, "Another new formula." At this point, pharmaceutics had become very advanced, and the medical properties of various medicinal materials had all been proven. In other words, the quantity of formulas had already reached its limit in the eyes of various pharmacists. Coming up with a new formula was profoundly difficult. The formula of a potion was not a random combination of several medicinal material. Otherwise, any random mixture could have been called a potion too, and there would have been countless formulas. The effects of the formula and its feasibility were the deciding factors of a formula's survival. Lin Li's low-level formula gave Wilkinson a greater shock than formulas given by pharmaceutics masters and gurus would. Low-level medicaments were the most developed due to the fact that their ingredients were easily obtainable, and they could be prepared without much effort or danger. Simply put, they wouldn't feel the pinch regardless of how many experiments they conducted, since the materials were not expensive. Hence, there were more formulas, which were all comprehensive. Since the various combinations of chemicals had all been tried and tested, it would be difficult to come up with a new one. In fact, there were plenty who had tried before the formula that Lin Li now came up with. However, they had probably given up because of the inexplicable questions that came along with the formula, just like with that weakened bone erosion powder. "What's wrong, Wilkinson? Is this formula new too?" one of them asked curiously after hearing Wilkinson's words. Not everyone paid attention to his speech, and people would usually only use, and therefore know, a few dozens of types of recipes. Wilkinson nodded, and said, "It seems that teacher's decision was right. Based on these two formulas, we can be sure that President Felix's teacher must be an extremely knowledgeable master. I really hope to ask him for advice." "Is he that impressive?" Wilkinson's peer, who was next to him, was skeptical. After a moment of thought, he said, "We haven't met President Felix's teacher yet. Why don't we find an excuse and see if we can meet him? If he doesn't have any skill at all and had only gotten these two formulas by dumb luck, we will be able to go back and explain it to President Balba." "This doesn't seem too appropriate," said Wilkinson, but was actually a little tempted. For a pharmacist, nothing was more appealing than getting a master's advice. Although his teacher Balba was also a master of pharmacy. Each master had his own area of expertise and different perception of pharmacy. Although a sufficient amount of bone erosion powder had already been prepared, Lin Li did not immediately place the bone erosion powder in the magic gears of New Black Clouds Town. Instead, he planned to wait until all the required potions were prepared before completing everything once and for all, lest someone notice the magic gears. Besides, it would be rather troublesome to open the magic gears again and again. Upon returning to the room, Lin Li immediately grabbed a book on magic from the bookshelf, and sat in the study room where he read it carefully, not wasting any time at all. However, someone suddenly knocked. Lin Li put the book down, stood up, and called the person outside to enter. It turned out to be Wilkinson, giving Lin Li a surprise. After all, he had just parted with Wilkinson and the rest. "Oh, it's you, Wilkinson. Is there something wrong with the formula?" "No, it's not an issue with the formula. I just have some questions about pharmaceutics. Could you get your teacher to give me some guidance, President Felek?" Wilkinson frantically said with an awkward expression. Lin Li was caught off guard for a moment, wondering why he suddenly had a master. Even Anduin might not be able to answer Wilkinson's questions. "I know this request may be a little too much. Forget it if it's going to disturb your teacher." Wilkinson thought that Lin Li spaced out because he was put on the spot, and thus began to feel embarrassed. Nothing, it's nothing much. Do you mind sharing with me the questions that you'd like to ask?" Lin Li asked. "Well, the thing is..." Wilkinson could not reject it, hence, he whipped out a piece of paper. "I've written them down on this piece of paper. When your teacher is free, please help me ask those questions." Lin Li grabbed the piece of paper on which the questions were written, glanced at the contents, and nodded secretly. He could tell from the questions that Wilkinson was indeed very talented in pharmaceutics, and it would be difficult for normal people to grasp the key points of the questions. Once the questions were answered, Wilkinson's knowledge would be taken to greater heights. "In that case, I shall not disturb you any longer, President Felek," Wilkinson said while staring at Lin Li, who he felt would not be able to answer the pharmaceutical questions that he had just asked. Hence, he left in disappointment. "Wait a minute," said Lin Li, who decided to tell Wilkinson the answers to his questions since there was nothing important for him to do at the moment. "You don't have anything urgent to do now, do you? I know how to answer your questions. If you're not in a hurry, take a seat and hear me out." "What?" Wilkinson asked in astonishment, thinking that he had heard wrongly. Lin Li immediately shook his head, and said, "It's just questions about the double helix cold extraction technique and the 9-color qualitative theory." "What's so difficult about that?" Wilkinson shrieked in shock after hearing Lin Li's words, just as he was about to turn around to leave. He almost thought that he was out of his mind. Wilkinson himself was already an intermediate pharmacist, and a proud disciple of Master Balba. Hence, he would obviously raise substantial and difficult questions. Actually, ever since Wilkinson arrived and gained some inspiration from the concoction of process of the modified bone erosion powder, Wilkinson could vaguely sense that only a senior pharmacist would be able to answer his questions. Those 2 questions belonged to the scope of advanced pharmacy, and could only be answered by the senior pharmacists. Yet, the young Lin Li who had just been deduced by them to be an intermediate-level pharmacist actually said that he could answer his questions. Wilkinson refused to believe it at all. "Let's go, I'll just tell you guys about it all together." Lin Li walked out of the door with a piece of paper. Although he initially planned to officially begin teaching the pharmacists some knowledge only after all of the potions required by Black Cloud's town had been concocted. Since Wilkinson had already asked him those questions that were rather symbolic, he decided to tell them about it lest they asked him those questions again. "Wait a minute, President Felek," Wilkinson was at a loss. Could it be that this young mage turned out to just be an old demon who had a young appearance? He could no longer tell if he was out of his mind or this mage was just too crazy. How much could one achieve at the age of 20? Wilkinson became an intermediate pharmacist at the age of 21, and the entire pharmacist guild was taken by storm back then. In the history of pharmacy, there had never been such a young intermediate pharmacist. Although Wilkinson had a reserved and humble personality, he was also a young man, after all, and it made sense for him to be proud of his own achievements. But now... Everyone, wait a minute. Wilkinson finally snapped back to reality after hearing his words, only to discover that he had somehow followed President Felek to the pharmaceutical lab. President Felek was walking towards the podium while all of Wilkinson's peers stared at him peculiarly. "Wilkinson, go back to your seat." Lin Li arrived at the podium. Although he had never been a teacher before, He knew what teachers were like, because he had seen them before he traveled through space and time. However, he sounded like a teacher. Wilkinson expressed assent and did not reject at all. While everyone stared at him peculiarly, he obediently returned to his seat. "Hey, what's the matter? Didn't you go to consult him?" "Why is he here?" one of them asked Wilkinson softly. Wilkinson smiled wryly, and said, "I still haven't gotten the clear idea yet. We'd better look at it together." Lin Li cleared his throat, and said, "Wilkinson came to look for me just now, saying that he had encountered some tricky issues. Although you guys can't apply it yet, it's better to know more." Everyone finally realized that President Felix, who was standing on the podium, was actually going to give them a lecture. It was way too crazy, absurd, ridiculous, and unacceptable. Although the pharmacists were only low-level and intermediate ones, their teachers were senior pharmacists, and they often attended lectures by masters. What rights did he have to lecture them from the podium? The pharmacists below the podium did not actually open the door to storm off angrily. Instead, they just remained seated and waited to see him make a joke out of himself. Some of them had already secretly gotten ready to make things hard for Lin Li and let him know that not everyone could be a teacher. However, as Lin Li proceeded with the lecture, the audience's mindset began to change slowly. They were all known as geniuses, and none would reject a chance to learn just out of spite. Lin Li was the only one speaking in the room. The young pharmaceutical geniuses below the rostrum had already been completely convinced by him. They were in absolute awe, and were entirely focused. They were afraid that they would miss even a piece of information taught by Lin Li. In fact, their breathing even began to slow down. In the eyes of the pharmacists, Lin Li's figure began to get blurry, and they began to forget his age and identity. At this moment, he was purely a lecturer. They didn't wish to think about anything at all, and were just listening to him attentively. No one would say no to additional knowledge. Lin Li stood on the podium and continued to rattle on and on while scanning the faces of the pharmacists below the podium. He was rather pleased with their attitude for now, especially since they were interested in learning and their passion was so strong that they could not be distracted at all. Although he wasn't a teacher to begin with, he believed that it would be easier to teach them from now on. Lin Li carefully analyzed and explained the questions posed by Wilkinson from every aspect. He only stopped after 2 hours. At this moment, the pharmacists below the podium were engrossed in new knowledge, and none of them was saying a single word. By the time Wilkinson snapped back to reality, he discovered that Lin Li had already vanished. Everyone broke into an uproar, and shock and disbelief were written all over their faces. Just now. Was I dreaming just now? It was way too absurd. Was that young president really only 20 years old? Everything that he had seen just now made him suspect that he was just a high elf who was surrounded by humans. Pharmaceutics were different from magic, which required talent and flair. It was an accumulation of knowledge. Talent would only allow one to learn quickly and understand things better. However, it would still require some time for knowledge to be picked up. Oh God, the things that he said just now. Surely he can't be a senior pharmacist? Everyone shared the same doubts. Words were not enough to describe the stellar achievements that the young mage, Lin Li, had made. Actually, intermediate pharmacists might have that kind of knowledge too. Others soon began to rebut, especially Wilkinson, who had raised the questions. The fact that he could explain the questions so clearly means that he must be an intermediate pharmacist who's about to advance soon, Wilkinson murmured. Who is the pharmaceutics guru who taught him? He nurtured such a monster, they said enviously. Everyone felt that they had gained a lot from the lesson this time, and began to get more curious about Lin Li. It was extremely difficult to teach and nurture one into a senior pharmacist, what more a 20-year-old. Although the pharmacists there were all intermediate and low-level ones, none of them were senior pharmacists. However, they could tell that the content of the lecture was genuine. The pharmacists were busy gossiping about Lin Li and discussing the knowledge that they had gained during the lecture. They seemed rather rowdy in the room. Pat. Wilkinson slammed his hand against the table and stood up, after which everyone fell silent. "What's wrong, Wilkinson?" one of his peers asked concernedly. Sensing that he had acted inappropriately, Wilkinson frantically said, "Nothing much. I just suddenly thought about something." He then left his seat and walked out of the room. Everyone looked at each other in shock and dismay. They had no idea what was wrong with Wilkinson. Wilkinson ignored their speculations and exited the room, after which he immediately returned to his room to rest. He then began fumbling about and ransacking his suitcase, pouring all of his clothes and items onto the bed. It looked as if a burglar had just broken into his room. A long while later, Wilkinson finally found a crumpled and tattered letter in the pocket of his clothes. "Damn it. How did I forget teacher's instructions and cause the latter to end up in such a state? How am I supposed to bring this to President Felek?" Wilkinson murmured in frustration. As it turned out, when Wilkinson and his peers were brought to the Tower of Dusk by Jirian, Balba handed a letter to Wilkinson and instructed him to hand it to Lin Li. However, Wilkinson, like everyone else, thought that he was exiled to the Tower of Dusk by Balba, and naturally didn't take his words seriously. After everything that happened in the past few days, Wilkinson already knew that he and others were not exiled, but were actually sent there to receive training. He could say confidently and truthfully that the trip was worth it. He only remembered about the letter now. Wilkinson read the letter over and over again for a while, after which he felt a sudden movement in his heart made him curious about the content of the letter. He felt a strong urge to sneak a peek at the letter since there was no one else around him. There was no magical seal or glue on the envelope. Clearly, the letter was not meant to be confidential, hence, he reckoned that it should be fine to sneak a peek. Wilkinson finally persuaded himself to open the letter. "Master Felek." Wilkinson almost fell off his chair in shock. In the world of Amril, not everyone could be called a master, for it was an honorific and not just a polite term. "I must have seen wrongly. Perhaps this letter is for President Felek's teacher?" Wilkinson dared not believe his eyes. He rubbed them, but realized that there were no changes in the letter at all. Suppressing the shock within him, Wilkinson continued to look at the rest of the letter, only to get more and more shocked. If it weren't for the fact that he had already met President Felek, he would have thought that the letter was for an elder who was as senior as Balba. However, the truth was that the letter was written to a young mage who had just turned 20 years old. Still, Balba did not sound like an elder who was speaking to his junior, and it was as if the two were friends instead. Balba often spoke to his juniors condescendingly. However, he seemed to look up to Felek. Wilkinson could no longer continue thinking about it, for the shock the letter brought him was indescribable. He thought that that was all. However, he only realized that everything was not over yet when he flipped to the second page of the letter. What is this? Teacher Balba is actually seeking help from President Felek? Was there anything more absurd than this? Wilkinson was about to collapse. Teacher Balba was not only the president of the Pharmacists' Guild, but also a senior pharmacist. No one knew his academic accomplishments better than Wilkinson did. Yet, he was asking President Felek about pharmaceutics with utmost sincerity. Yes, he was not just trying to discuss pharmaceutics with Felek, and Wilkinson could obviously tell what Balba meant. Balba seemed to be sure that Felek could answer all the questions. It turns out there was no mysterious master at all. Felek was the pharmaceutics master, Wilkinson muttered to himself. Wilkinson did not doubt the abilities of the young President Felek. The letter that he read today was the best answer for his question. Just as Wilkinson was deep in thought, his friend scurried towards the room, only to see that he was staring blankly out of the window. Someone stepped forth to pat Wilkinson on his shoulder, and asked, "Wilkinson, what's wrong? Why are you so deep in thought?" Wilkinson finally snapped out of his trance and stared at his peers, wondering how he should talk to them about it. He did not wish to lose the learning opportunity in a moment of anger. However, he couldn't let them read the letter. Hence, he folded it, and said, "It's a letter from teacher to Master Felek." Wait, what did you say? Master Felek. President Felek was the only Felek they knew. How could he be a master? They all thought that there was something wrong with their ears. They glanced at the letter immediately. If it had been something else, they would have long snatched it away to take a look. However, it was a letter from Teacher Balba, and it would be inappropriate for them to look at it since they were not Teacher Balba's students, unlike Wilkinson. Yes, Teacher Balba said in the letter that although President Felix has not registered with our pharmacist guild, his accomplishments in pharmacy have definitely reached the master level, Wilkinson said in a shaky voice, clearly yet to recover from the shock. Upon hearing Wilkinson's words, the expressions on the faces of several pharmacists suddenly became sullen, and their eyes slowly began to widen together with their mouths. It was as if their jaws were about to dislocate. What a joke. No one would be able to keep calm after hearing such news. It could be said that a pharmaceutics master was the highest position in the world of Amrel. Even legendary powerhouses would have to be polite and courteous to him. They said in a shaky voice. Could it be real? That President Felix. He's only 20 years old. How could he be a pharmaceutics master? It was unbelievable and beyond their imagination. If he were an intermediate pharmacist at 20, he would be a genius. However, if he were a master, it would be absolutely incredible. However, the truth was that he was indeed a 20-year-old pharmaceutics master. Pharmaceutics master. The news soon spread amongst the 35 pharmacists, all of whom could not believe their ears. However, they felt excited and overjoyed after recovering from the immense shock. They spent the past few days concocting an advanced potion, after which Lin Li answered Wilkinson's questions. After 2 lectures by Lin Li, they had completely begun admiring and respecting him. At this point, they finally understood Balba's reasons for sending them there. They knew that Balba had their best interests at heart when he decided to send them there. They finally knew that the training program would be beneficial to them. Wilkinson held on to the crumpled letter and handed it to Lin Li with a heavy heart. The rest finally got reminded of their tasks. However, things were different this time. They were much more hard-working because they all knew how precious the advice of a master was. President Felix, this is a letter that teacher wanted me to give you, but because, of some reasons, I only managed to give it to you now. I'm very sorry, Wilkinson said with an awkward expression on his face. He had no idea how he should explain the delay in handing the letter over to him. He couldn't possibly say that he had forgotten about it because of how frustrated he was. However, Lin Li was not bothered by the appearance of the letter. Anyway, there was no magical seal on the envelope, and it was clearly not an important letter. Thank you. He thanked Wilkinson and put the letter away before asking, is President Balba doing well? It has been some time since I left Alana. Oh, yes, President Balba is doing well. Lin Li did not talk about the appearance of the letter, so Wilkinson finally heaved a sigh of relief. After all, he knew that he was not just facing the president of a guild of magic. In fact, he was facing a pharmaceutics master. It was inevitable for him to feel stressed. Lin Li was just asking about Balba out of courtesy. After all, he ought to ask about Balba since he had asked his student to bring a letter to him. After speaking to Lin Li for a while, Wilkinson still did not dismiss himself. Noticing that Wilkinson seemed to want to say something, Lin Li asked, "What's the matter, Pharmacist Wilkinson? Is there something else you have to say?" It's just," Wilkinson decided to forego his pride. Staring at Lin Li enthusiastically, he said, "President Felix, I'd like to know when I can receive a lecture from you again." It seemed Balba's letter had given him plenty of help. Lin Li smiled, and said, "You guys should know that the potions that you're making now are to be used in Black Cloud's town's defense system. Hence, the proper lessons will begin after the potions are ready." Wilkinson was rather disappointed with the answer. However, after giving it some thought, he felt that it would only be right for him to run errands for Lin Li since the latter was teaching them for free. It wouldn't be appropriate for him to make Lin Li put off his work for the sake of teaching them. In that case, if they were to finish concocting the potions earlier, they would get to receive his teaching sooner. The thought of it made him feel excited again. He hurriedly bade Lin Li goodbye and excused himself. When Wilkinson returned, he was immediately surrounded by his peers who kept probing about Master Felix and when the latter would start teaching them. Even though they were the pioneers of the pharmacist guild, they might not be able to receive a lecture from a master. Upon hearing Wilkinson's answer, everyone immediately scurried back to their workstations. Just like what Wilkinson had thought, they were all eager about helping Master Fellick complete the potions at the soonest so that they could receive his teachings as soon as possible. Hope was the motivation that would spur humans to continue striving forwards. Hence, the pharmacists began to work rapidly with maximum efficiency. About 6 days later, the potions that Lin Li had designed for Black Cloud's town's defense system were completed. All of the potions were modified and made weaker, mainly because Lin Li did not intend to make the potions lethal, and instead just wanted to use them to deal with his enemies by incapacitating them. The poisonous potions had a high penetration rate and were extremely dangerous. However, the weakened versions would not cause too much harm to the residents of Black Cloud's town. Once the potions were placed in the magic gears, the defense system of Black Cloud's town would finally be completed. The pharmacist's jobs would then be to concoct some potions that were meant for sale. Of course, Lin Li did not forget about the promise that he had made earlier. He would arrange a 2-hour lecture for them every day. After all, Lin Li had to do his own tasks that were relatively important as well. It would be impossible for him to be a full-time teacher, and there was only a short period of time left before the deadline given by Tutankhamun arrived. It was hard for him to squeeze out 2 hours for lectures. The 2 hours of lecture time was not to be belittled, for it was far more effective than the lessons they received in the Pharmacists' Guild. However, the masters were way too busy to lecture them. Besides, Lin Li had more knowledge than most pharmacists did, and he also knew about plenty of techniques and theories that many other masters, including Balba, did not know about. Although the pharmacists had already deduced that Lin Li was a pharmaceutics master, Lin Li was actually a pharmaceutics guru. Before the lessons officially began, the young pharmacists were feeling rather worried. Most people tended to think that good things didn't come cheap. Besides, the training program was free. No matter how capable Lin Li might be, or how much more knowledge he had compared to President Balba, there would be no point if he refused to help. However, the question that Lin Li gave them during the first lesson immediately cleared their doubts. What was the most important thing to a pharmacist? The formulae of potions. The formulae of potions were mandatory, just like spells for mages. In order to master a formula, one would have to be familiar with the ingredients it required. If one only knew how to collect ingredients, they would forever perform just one task. What Lin Li taught was the deduction of the medicinal properties through the analysis of the formula so as to allow one to thoroughly grasp the formula. In fact, that was also the method that he used to modify those banned formulas and weaken them. Through the medicinal deduction method, the pharmacist could not only discover the medicinal properties of the medicinal materials right from the beginning, but also understand the medicinal properties of various medicinal materials during the preparation process. For these young pharmacists, the medicinal deduction method was definitely a precious piece of knowledge that could benefit them for life. Perhaps the effects were not too obvious for them yet, since they were not skilled enough for now. However, when they came into contact with advanced formulas later, again, with this method, they would be able to understand them quicker and more thoroughly than others. The pharmacists were skeptical about learning such advanced skills relatively early, and were also feeling ashamed about the worries that they had. Such valuable pharmacological knowledge might not be imparted or taught to them even by their own teacher. However, it now seemed to be normal knowledge that they were free to pick up. As long as they mastered the method of deducing medicinal properties, the road to becoming senior pharmacists would be smooth sailing. Therefore, none of them felt aggrieved about having to prepare the potions for sale every day while they were studying. They would be willing to learn for 10 years if they could master the technique. It was all just the beginning. Everyone had their own strengths and weaknesses, including the pharmacists. However, the young pharmacists discovered that Lin Li seemed to be an expert at pharmaceutics and was not just dabbling in them. As the lesson progressed, they began to learn about many theories and techniques that they had never heard of in the past, all of which gave them a new perspective of the world. However, the young pharmacists could not tell where the limit of Lin Li's knowledge was. There was even one time when the young pharmacists bet in private to see who could find questions that Master Felix couldn't answer. If it were President Balba and not Master Felix, they definitely wouldn't dare to do so. However, this Master Felix was only 20 years old. However, they were only intermediate-level paper pharmacists, and it was a tall order for them to find a problem that would stump Master Felix. Hence, after one of the lectures, Wilkinson came up with a question about the Hopper conjecture, a very famous problem in pharmacy, and decided to ask the young Master Felix about it. Lin Li had not really studied the pharmaceutic theories of this world, nor did he have an accurate understanding of the standards of pharmacy there. He could only extrapolate them from what the pharmacists in Amril he had interacted with so far knew. Hence, how could he have known that Wilkinson had given him a well-known unresolved problem in the history of pharmacy in Amril? He simply thought that it was a problem that only intermediate pharmacists would encounter, and would at most just involve advanced pharmacology. "Oh, this problem," Lin Li murmured after looking at it. Wilkinson waved behind and gestured to his peers that he had succeeded in getting Master Felix to answer their question. However, he ended up being despised by his peers who kept saying that the questions was impossible to solve. There were barely any pharmacists who could answer such a question. However, Lin Li's words gave everyone a great shock, including Wilkinson. "Enough, this question is interesting. There happens to be some time now. I shall tell you guys about this." Lin Li ignored their reactions and instead turned around to walk towards the rostrum. He then wrote down the solution while saying, "In order to solve this problem, we'd have to apply intermediate pharmaceutics knowledge. However, it's good for you low-level pharmacists to take a look." Staring at Lin Li, who was scribbling on the blackboard, Wilkinson and the rest fell speechless. They finally realized that the pharmaceutics master Lin Li did not belong to the same world as them at all. Ever since then, the young pharmacists were dumbfounded, and they began to see President Felix as Master Felix. No one felt awkward about addressing a junior using an honorific term. In fact, they genuinely began to admire him. 3 months flew by. A young pharmacist was dripping some transparent liquid into a crystal cup using a pipette. All of a sudden, silvery fumes of smoke and glitter filled the air while the transparent liquid in the crystal cup turned silver, resembling mercury. "We've succeeded." The young pharmacist gently placed the crystal cup down and jumped for joy in excitement. The successful concoction of an advanced potion meant that the young pharmacist was far more experienced than senior pharmacists. However, he was the 22nd pharmacist who had successfully advanced to a senior rank. After 3 months of learning under Lin Li, the 35 pharmacists experienced major changes. The first were Wilkinson and 5 other intermediate pharmacists, who advanced within less than a month. The rest was not lagging behind, either. They advanced rapidly from low-level to senior pharmacists. Their speed was in fact unprecedented. So far, 20 out of the 35 young pharmacists had already reached the level of senior pharmacists, while Wilkinson, Balba's proud disciple, had already internalized all of the advanced pharmaceutics knowledge. He would become a master soon. Although it had only been more than 3 months since the Sire bandits had been eradicated, the reconstruction of Black Cloud's town was the only thing that followed. However, the factions of the Breezy Plains did not stop paying attention to the Tower of Dusk. After all, the Tower of Dusk was an important faction related to the Manhwa family. Hence, the news of there being a group of senior pharmacists at the Tower of Dusk began to spread. It was so astonishing that no one could accept it calmly. An archmage could still be affected by some factions, like the adventurer Amidst, who got recruited by the Manhwa family. However, a senior pharmacist was rarely recruited, unless by an extraordinary and powerful authority like the Supreme Council. Similarly, a pharmaceutics guru would rarely be recruited unless by the Pharmacist Guild. Hence, to most of the powerful authorities, senior pharmacists could be said to be their limit when it came to recruitment. Every one of them was an invaluable treasure. There were more than 20 senior pharmacists in the Tower of Dusk, so everyone in the Breezy Plains was jealous and envious of the Tower of Dusk. The mercenary corps were only a small group in the breezy plains, but their leader, Ona, was very ambitious. He was also famous for a period of time during the establishment of the Tower of Dusk. Although he was just the leader of less than 200 mercenaries, he still managed to instruct some of his subordinates to pay attention to the Tower of Dusk. Actually, the mercenary corps did have some comments and opinions of their own about Ona wasting humanitarian and monetary resources. After all, there were less than 200 members in the corps, and they were perhaps only a little bit stronger than the adventurers in the breezy plains. What would the situation of the Tower of Dusk have to do with such a small faction? However, Ona had a different opinion. He felt that the Tower of Dusk had to be rather powerful since it could grow so rapidly within a short period of time. Even if Ona did not gain any benefits, it would be advantageous to his mercenary corps if he could find out the secrets behind their development. It was the day of receiving the news, and just like in the past, Ona was in the middle of a swordsmanship routine in the backyard. Later on, he wiped his sweat and picked up an intel report that he had received just now. After examining the seal on it, he tore the envelope open and pulled out the letter inside. His wrist vibrated a little, and the letter was removed from the envelope. He then sat on the chair and picked up the cup of tea that he had prepared beforehand. He then immediately snorted with laughter. He spat his tea out at the same time, but, fortunately, he had taken the intel report away in time. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to read it anymore. After coughing a few times, he finally got a grip on himself and shifted his gaze onto the intel report. Damn it, do these two jerks think that their tasks are too easy? How dare they crack such a joke with me? Ona stared at the intel report, which contained news of the Tower of Dusk recruiting 20-odd pharmacists. There were plenty of factions in the breezy plains which were looking to recruit a senior pharmacist. Although the Tower of Dusk had gotten associated with the Manhwa family did not have that many senior pharmacists. Leader, what's wrong? His subordinate asked upon seeing his leader spitting the tea out. Ona threw the report onto the table with a wave. Damn it, seems like those two rascals have to be dismissed. How dare they give me such absurd intel? The subordinate glanced at the report on the table, after which his expression turned a little peculiar. Feeling a little displeased, Ona rebuked, "What's wrong? If there's something you have to say, say it. Stop acting so weird." Leader, this intel is real, said the subordinate. Really? How did you find out? Ona asked with a frown. Leader, the news of there being 20-odd senior pharmacists in the Tower of Dusk has spread all around the breezy plains. I have a friend. Ona dismissed his subordinate angrily with a sullen expression, after which he gritted his teeth and turned around to leave. How infuriating. I sent people to keep an eye, and yet I received the news 2 days later than everyone else. Why should I even keep them around? However, after getting angry, Ona remembered the content of the intelligence report. How could he let the Tower of Dusk keep all 20 senior pharmacists? He worked hard for the development of the mercenary corps, but it turned out he still wasn't as lucky as others. Ona suddenly remembered that he had a childhood friend who was now the chairman of a business association. He recalled chatting with him a while ago and talking about his self-made fortune and success. The friend said that he sold 1 fruit for the price of 2 fruits, and then sold 2 fruits for the price of 4 fruits. However, he revealed in the end that he could achieve all he had because he inherited the legacy of an elder. Luck had to be the trick for the rapid rise of the Tower of Twilight. Otherwise, how could they have gotten the favor of the Manhwa family with a small organization that they had just established? Ona suddenly felt a little discouraged, for he realized that there were many things that could not be achieved just by putting in effort. The development that he wanted for his team would be a huge leap for them. Unfortunately, an insignificant organization like theirs could not afford to even hope for a senior pharmacist, not to mention 20 or so of them. In fact, after the news broke, there were plenty of leaders of minor factions who had the same idea as Ona. They had worked hard to do everything they could for the development of their factions, but even after many years of hard work, they still could not be compared with others. No one would be able to stay calm under such circumstances. Plenty of people began cussing their hearts out and lamenting about their plight. Ona vented his anger and thought about the 20 senior pharmacists, after which he couldn't help but fantasize. If his team could get the support of 20 or so senior pharmacists, they would definitely be able to stand up to the Dark Blade and the Manhwa family, if they ever had to one day. He couldn't help but shiver, because it was all just a fantasy of his, while the Tower of Dusk did have more than 20 senior pharmacists. Well, this newly established Tower of Dusk was not far from their rise in the Breezy Plains. There were countless small forces like Ona's corps in the Breezy Plains, and all of them could only dream about having as many senior pharmacists as there were at the Tower of Dusk. However, there were many others apart from them who had the audacity to covet the senior pharmacists in the Tower of Dusk and think that they had the capital to fight the battle. How much could a newly established minor force offer to the senior pharmacists even if they were to get into the good books of the Manhwa family? Plenty of powerful forces thought that way. They felt that they could offer the same conditions and benefits that the Tower of Dusk had. Gadget, the leader of the ambitious White Shadow, could acutely sense an opportunity to rise. How had the Tower of Dusk attracted those senior pharmacists? Was it money? Although the White Shadow was not exactly a merchant organization, they owned many shops and businesses in cities of all sizes in the Breezy Plains. Hence, as far as money went, they might not be inferior to the Tower of Dusk at all. Or was it because of some attractive promises that they'd made? That couldn't be. The Tower of Dusk was just a small force that had been established less than a year ago. Regardless of how well it had been managed, it did not have a strong foundation, and was destined not to undergo any major development. The only possibility could be that they had pulled the personal relations card and done the pharmacists a favor. Everyone knew how hard it was to return favors. However, it would be impossible for so many senior pharmacists to owe an insignificant mage huge favors. Gadget analyzed the situation for a while, and was stunned by the results of his analysis. He was suddenly overwhelmed with euphoria. Yeah, in that case, those 20 or so senior pharmacists were basically prepared for others to take over. He smacked his hand against the armrest of his chair. Since the other forces might have thought of what he did too, he decided that he had to act fast. For a moment, the word of this group of senior pharmacists seemed to have swept the Breezy Plains like a hurricane. The various forces were like sharks that had smelled blood. They wished they could dash into the Tower of Dusk to snatch the pharmacists away. Of course, they also had to be mindful. After all, the Tower of Dusk had the formidable Manhwa family to support them. Compared to the past, the atmosphere in the Tower of Dusk was much livelier, and all forces had sent their people to try and approach the senior pharmacists in a bid to poach them. Although it was not as bustling as Manhwa City, Black Cloud's town had indeed become much more prosperous. The Tower of Dusk was becoming more and more lively. As the majordomo of the Tower of Dusk, Gavin was feeling extremely anxious, for he knew clearly what the senior pharmacists meant to Tower of Dusk. If any of them got poached, it would definitely be a huge loss that couldn't be compensated for. However, what was alarming was that the young president seemed to know nothing, and had yet to take any measures at all, let alone investigate who'd leaked the news. After seeing an outsider communicate with one of the senior pharmacists, Gavin finally couldn't hold it back anymore, and barged into the president's office in a hurry. "President, this can't go on. Those outsiders are absolutely dauntless. They actually had the guts to poach our people in our hall. They're completely disrespecting us." Gavin was feeling extremely anxious and displeased with the fact that others were trying to poach their pharmacists. "Oh, what else do you want me to do? Those pharmacists are not our slaves. We can't hide them from others," Lin Li said nonchalantly, seemingly not worried at all. It was as if the ones being poached were not his pharmacists. "If you're enjoying my content, please consider donating a coffee. Or checking out my shirts on TeePublic, but we should at least do something. Why don't I assemble some people and chase those outsiders away at least?" Gavin actually knew that Lin Li was right. Even the members of the Pharmacist Guild enjoyed the freedom of going wherever they wanted. Hence, they couldn't lock the senior pharmacists up like slaves. Nah, let them be. They can't poach my people unless they have what it takes. Lin Li was extremely confident. He thought, they're trying to poach my pharmacists? What a joke. They might be able to do so if they have a pharmaceutics guru. Gavin wanted to say something else, but could not think of a better idea even after racking his brains. He had just chased the people away, but he was just saying those things in a moment of spite. Although they were openly poaching the pharmacists, there would definitely be a public outrage if they were to get into a physical fight. Regardless of how strong the Tower of Dusk was, they might not be able to secure a footing in the breezy plains. Hence, the young owner of the Tower of Dusk, President Felix, allowed the matter to go on without doing anything. Not only did he not take any precautions to prevent the pharmacists from interacting with others, he even instructed the receptionists who were in charge of receiving the mages to summon people to help him as long as the outsiders tried to bribe him. Master Felix! Wilkinson yelled at the end of the lecture, trying to stop Lin Li, who was about to leave. "Oh, is there a problem?" Lin Li asked as he turned around, though he already knew what Wilkinson was about to say. "Master Felix, there is a sudden increase in the number of people outside. Could we trouble you to arrange for us to get some help? Whenever we go out, we end up getting harassed, and it takes us a lot of effort to shake them off," Wilkinson said resignedly. "Yeah, Master Felix, we don't know them either. They're making us scared to go out," the rest chimed in. It was just like Lin Li had expected. He smiled and asked, "Did they give you presents, too?" Wilkinson and the rest hurriedly explained, "They did, but we didn't accept them." Lin Li clapped with a regretful expression, and said, "Why not? Who says no to gifts? I've been teaching you guys for so long, yet you didn't even pick up such an important mindset. So, we should accept it?" Wilkinson asked apprehensively, as dumbfounded as his peers. "Yeah, it'd be a waste if you don't. Since they're willing to give you gifts, just accept them. It's no big deal," Lin Li said nonchalantly. But Wilkinson and the rest, who had never done something like that before, were extremely shocked. However, Lin Li left before they could even ask him another question. "Since Master Felix said that we should accept them, I shall not stand on ceremony," Wilkinson thought to himself. After having been led astray by Lin Li, Wilkinson and the other pharmacists eagerly accepted the gifts, which was to the joy of those who gave them gifts. "Sir, the targets have already accepted the gifts, they seem to have wavered." "Leader, the target has chatted with me for a longer duration than yesterday. I suggest that we continue to curry favor with them." Both the givers and recipients of the gifts were on cloud nine. However, the mages of the Tower of Dusk were living in fear every day, afraid that they would wake up one day and realize that there were no longer any senior pharmacists. However, there was an exception during the sucking up. Whenever the outsiders badmouthed Lin Li and the Tower of Dusk, they would relentlessly throw the presents onto the ground. Although the pharmacists were not good in magic, they were all ancestors one. Even if they went overboard, no one would dare to disrespect them. The outsiders might disregard the Tower of Dusk, but they wouldn't dare to ignore the presence of the pharmacists. Perhaps there were only a few capable ones in the pharmacist guild, but there were plenty of forces that were waiting to stand up for them. The leader of the White Shadow, Gadget, was feeling extremely smug about his great foresight. A force would have to stay ahead of others in order to develop well. It was his great foresight that would give him an edge in recruiting other senior pharmacists. The White Shadow would be taken to greater heights as long as they had one senior pharmacist in their team. At the beginning, many forces had concerns about the Manhwa family supporting the Tower of Dusk, but Gadget had a strong feeling that perhaps the relationship between the Tower of Dusk and the Manhwa family was not so close. However, the Tower of Dusk actually had more than 20 pharmacists. It could be said that it would not be impossible to surpass the Manhwa family as long as they had enough time. Could the Manhwa family possibly watch their position being undermined? Gadget couldn't guess what the Manhwa family was thinking, but he was certain that he would have definitely taken action against the Tower of Dusk and acquired the 20-odd senior pharmacists if he had the support of the Manhwa family. Even if he were to offend the Supreme Council, it would be worth it. Besides, the Supreme Council wouldn't fall out with the Manhwa family because of the newly established Guild of Magic. Gadget could not figure out the reason for the Manhwa family's silence, but he was certain that he felt tempted about the 20-odd senior pharmacists. No matter what concerns the Manhwa family had, they wouldn't be able to hold back for too long. Hence, he decided to act first and send his able subordinates to the Tower of Dusk in hopes of getting his hands on a senior pharmacist before the Manhwa family could. Gadget was not afraid of offending the Manhwa family at all. Senior pharmacists were precious gems, but they were not inanimate objects, after all, and were in fact humans who enjoyed a high status. Not all powerful factions were allowed to resort to violence. They still had to consider the opinions of the pharmacists. Besides, there was only one solution they could use to deal with the pharmacists, and that was to win them over using personal relations and offering them benefits. They might not stand to gain if they were to resort to violence. Indeed, Gadget received the news that he wanted. 10 days after arriving at the Tower of Dusk, Gadget's confidant informed him that he had successfully gotten associated with a senior pharmacist who had accepted 4 of his gifts without hesitation. That would make things easier for them. Relationships were built through mutual respect and kindness. Gadget's greatest worry was that they might refuse to accept his gifts, thus leaving him with no way to nurture and build a good relationship with them. However, it seemed that the senior pharmacists were not ascetic and thick in the head, after all. They could actually be tempted by gifts. Gadget was thinking that the pharmacist definitely knew his intentions for giving him the gifts which he had all accepted without hesitating or turning down. Since the pharmacist had already accepted his gift, it meant that the pharmacist did not have that strong of a relationship with the Tower of Dusk. Although the White Shadow wasn't powerful, they had put in plenty of effort into the gifts, and it was now Gadget's turn to recruit the pharmacist personally. The pharmacists in the Tower of Dusk were definitely showered with gifts, something that had never happened before in the Pharmacist Guild. Of course, when they were in the Pharmacist Guild, they still had yet to advance to the rank of senior pharmacists, and thus wouldn't receive such fanfare. Although some of the gifts were very tempting, the pharmacists dared not accept them at the start because they were well aware that Lin Li was the one who had given them the glory and success that they had today. It was indeed a far-fetched idea for them to advance to the senior level without the training program. They did not want President Felix to get the wrong idea. If they were to get chased out, the gifts would not be able to make up for it. The young pharmacists admired President Felix for being magnanimous instead of holding it against them. He even encouraged them to accept the gifts as much as they wanted. That made things easier because they wouldn't feel emotionally burdened when receiving gifts now that President Felix didn't mind it. Although the young pharmacists did not talk about it explicitly, Wilkinson could vaguely tell what they were thinking since he was their leader. Hence, plenty of forces saw Wilkinson as their greatest target. The White Shadow was one of them. Plenty of forces and factions were all trying to cast their net and see how many pharmacists they can get. They would give every pharmacist that they saw a gift. They were thinking that they could at least recruit one. However, the White Shadow decided to take a different approach. Gadget chose to gather all of his resources and make a heavy bet in hopes of being sincere enough to move the senior pharmacist called Wilkinson. Gadget knew his weakness. Although he ran businesses all over the breezy plains, he was not the wealthiest. If he were to choose to cast his net, they might end up not getting a single pharmacist. Hence, he felt that it would be better to bank on just one pharmacist to beat all of their competitors. It was a decision that made Gadget feel extremely smug. Unlike others, he handed out one hefty gift on 4 separate occasions instead of several minor ones. He naturally had to stand out from the other forces since he had to give the pharmacist a good impression. Every day at daybreak, all the forces would gather in the parade square of the Tower of Dusk. There were also people sent by the external forces but were all chased away by the more powerful forces. They camped in front of the Tower of Dusk and would immediately try to bootlick whenever they saw a pharmacist exiting. They would then go through the process of giving a gift and currying favor with them. In the eyes of the people who had no idea what was going on, this scene was indeed too weird and absurd. There had to be a proper time and place for gift-giving and recruiting. How could they be so unconcerned about the location? However, everyone knew that the problem was that there was no decent venue in this small place, and that the pharmacists did not accept any invitations at all. One of the forces put in plenty of effort by hiring a chef to whip up delicious dishes with the finest ingredients in a bid to sit down and have a chat with a senior pharmacist. However, the pharmacist responded by telling them to leave the gifts at the door because he was too lazy to receive them. They had no choice but to suck it up, since the pharmacists were big shots. Hence, everyone began bootlicking and sucking up to everyone for the sake of presenting the gifts. Gadget rushed to the Tower of Dusk with a hefty gift and waited quietly for the doors to open together with the rest of the crowd. He saw plenty of people, some of which were allies, while others were archenemies. However, everyone was a fellow competitor, be it friend or foe. Looking up at the towering Tower of Dusk, Gadget could not help but sigh. Although this tower had just been established, its foundation was indeed solid, and it was no wonder that it was favored by the Manhwa family. If the senior pharmacists were to spend more time in the Tower of Dusk, the rise of the tower would be inevitable. However, Gadget felt that they did not have what it took to keep him around. Gadget began to feel a little nervous, for the recruitment of a senior pharmacist would affect the rise of the White Shadow, yet he had so many competitors. Time passed while he waited anxiously, and the doors of the Tower of Dusk finally opened slowly. Everyone in the plaza immediately sobered up, but they did not rush forth at once. After all, they were all figures of status, and still had to maintain their image during the recruitment. Hence, they slowly made their way into the hall of the Tower of Dusk in an orderly fashion. As everyone walked into the Tower of Twilight, the spacious and elegantly decorated hall immediately made Gadget's eyes light up, especially the furnishings, which exuded a strong and refined elegance. However, Gadget soon shook his head secretly, and sighed in his heart while thinking to himself, such a delicate elven-style decoration may not be bought even with an exorbitant amount of money. It's such a pity that the president of the Tower of Dusk can't afford to enjoy such a luxury at all. What is he thinking? Next, Gadget witnessed another strange thing. Although he had heard it from his close friends, he still couldn't believe it. As it turned out, they could register an appointment with the mage who was in charge of the reception at the Tower of Dusk. Although their attitude seemed hostile, they did not make things too difficult for them. Seems like they, too, know that they don't have the means to keep these senior pharmacists, Gadget said with a cold smirk. The president of the Tower of Dusk was protecting himself by doing this. That was the sad truth about smaller forces and factions. They'd never be able to save the good things that they had. Most of the time, it might even lead to a tragedy of destruction. After going down to register an appointment, Gadget waited for the senior pharmacist to arrive, just like everyone else. At this moment, something happened that made everyone feel exasperated. There was not a single chair in the spacious hall that the guests could sit on. Although the guests were not that weak and could manage standing for a while, it was too embarrassing to just stand and wait. In fact, there was a special reception room in the Tower of Dusk, but the mages simply couldn't wait to use magic to destroy those outsiders. How could they possibly provide them with a resting area? Made to stay in the hall, they would probably leave sooner, and the chances of the pharmacists being poached would be greatly reduced. What was not to love? Fortunately, the first pharmacist appeared a short while later. According to plan, one of the forces smiled and walked towards them in preparation to present them with the gifts. After one of the pharmacists accepted the gift, the person who presented the gift tried to speak. However, the pharmacist waved his hand in annoyance, turned around, and left the hall, leaving the other party behind. However, no one got displeased with his standoffish attitude. To them, it was normal for senior pharmacists to be short-tempered. It would be strange otherwise. They might even doubt the capabilities of the pharmacists if they did not have an eccentric attitude. Hence, the person who presented the gift did not mind it, and instead just shook his head regretfully and left, feeling a little comforted that the pharmacist had accepted his gift. The pharmacists began to walk down one by one while the forces presented the gifts in an orderly fashion. It was finally Gadget's turn. In fact, when others saw the leader of the White Shadow, Gadget, arriving in person, they could already guess what he was going to do there. Everyone was suspicious, and they shifted their attention onto Gadget. Although they hoped to see him prove that it was possible to recruit senior pharmacists, they did not want him to succeed in recruiting any, either. Everyone stared at Gadget while he walked towards the senior pharmacist Wilkinson. Staring at the handsome and arrogant face in front of him, Gadget began to get a little distracted, and he sighed while thinking to himself, he's so young, yet he's already a senior pharmacist. When will he become a pharmaceutics master? Respectable Mr. Pharmacist, please let me introduce you to the president of White Shadow. Upon hearing the introduction by his confidant, Gadget snapped back to reality, and quickly put a smile on his face. He respectfully said to Wilkinson, "Dear Mr. Pharmacist." Gadget and Castellans could be considered buddies and brothers. However, Gadget had no choice but to suck up to the pharmacists for the sake of the White Shadow. His confidant gasped in shock and turned red after thinking about the words that his leader had said and the things that he had done to Bootlick. However, Wilkinson was not that interested, as all he could think about was pharmaceutical theories. He frowned in annoyance and coldly said, "Did you ask to see me for the sake of this? I don't have that much time to waste talking to you about these pointless things." He then turned around and left. Gadget wished he could give himself 2 tight slaps. He's a senior pharmacist. He has heard all kinds of compliments. Since when does he have to listen to my praises? Seeing that Wilkinson was about to leave soon, he frantically said, "Please wait a minute, Mr. Pharmacist. I was being too long-winded. I do have something to discuss with you, Mr. Pharmacist." Wilkinson pinched his nose and turned around to say to him, "Cut straight to the chase, then. Stop talking to me about such rubbish. Be careful, I might just get someone to chase you out." "Yeah," Gadget replied. Although he was the leader of the dignified White Shadow, he had no choice but to swallow his pride now. However, despite being reprimanded by a young man, he didn't feel ashamed at all, because everyone here had experienced it more than once before, be it an ally or a rival. He grabbed the prepared gift from his confidant, and presented it respectfully while saying, "Dear Pharmacist, this is a gift I specially prepared for you this time. I hope you can accept it." Why did he have to beat around the bush? He could have just said that he was going to give me a present, Wilkinson thought to himself with a look of displeasure. He grabbed the gift from Gadget to see that it was a flat black-colored sandalwood box, on which there were designs painted in gold, making the box look exceptionally exquisite. Fortunately, the pharmacists were not powerless. Wilkinson held onto the box with one hand, and removed the lid with a loud thud using the other. Opening the gift in public immediately upon reception was another offensive, provocative tactic that Lin Li had deliberately taught to the pharmacists. By doing so, others would be able to see the value of the gift, hence, the next time another person gave them a gift, it'd have to be of a higher value. Although the young pharmacists could not be bothered to tease those who brought gifts, they decided to do it since it was Master Felic's request. They wouldn't lose anything anyway. It was not even the pharmacist's concern whether it was rude to open the gifts right away. At the instant that the box was opened, everyone else gasped in shock, while Wilkinson remained composed because he had seen enough not to be fazed by it. Gadget had indeed spent a bomb on the gift. The oblong wooden box contained a set of test tubes that were often used by pharmacists when preparing chemicals and potions, though they were not made of glass. Wilkinson recognized at a glance that the test tubes were made of very precious crystal of clear skies. Although it was not as precious as the crystal of eternity, it was also a rare and precious material. The carved test tubes that were made of the crystal of clear skies had an excellent catalytic effect on the medicinal materials during the preparation of potions, and could shorten the reaction time, especially for those which required a long one. Simply put, it might take just 2 or 3 days for Wilkinson to prepare a potion successfully with such a set of such test tubes, while others might need 10 days to prepare the same potion. The test tubes were absolutely attractive for pharmacists. It was no wonder that Gadget would select them as a recruitment gift. Gadget had spent a hefty amount on them, but it was not an issue of money, because the test tubes could not necessarily be bought with money. It could be said that in the battle for the pharmacists in the Tower of Dusk, some of the merchants who had made mistakes in their investments now indirectly benefited from them together with the other residents of Black Cloud's town. There were barely any senior pharmacists in the breezy plains, and the expensive pharmaceutical equipment was rarely sold. They were mostly just precious gems that added glory to the store. But now, not only were there plenty of people who were rushing to buy those items, the prices were soaring all the time too. Hence, those merchants who'd almost bankrupted suddenly got a new lease on life. If the forces could successfully poach the pharmacists, they would benefit the most, but if they failed. Wilkinson put the lid back onto the wooden box, nodded, and said, "Well, it's a superb present. Someone, come over and help me bring this back to my room." He called a mage apprentice of the Tower of Dusk, and instructed him to send the set of Crystal of Clear Skies test tubes back to his room. Seeing that Wilkinson had taken things away, Gadget secretly heaved a sigh of relief. As long as he accepted the gifts, there would be a chance for discussion. At this moment, everyone around him was feeling rather regretful, because everyone knew that Wilkinson was the best pharmacist here. "What else do you have to say?" asked Wilkinson, who sounded just as aloof and annoyed as previously, even after accepting the gift. It was as if accepting gifts was a waste of his time. Gadget looked around, and finally said the things that he had prepared earlier on. "Dear Mr. Pharmacist, may I have the honor to invite you to the White Shadow? We may not have the best conditions, but we're very famous in the breezy plains. I can assure that you'll be our most valued guest." He then introduced Wilkinson to the status of the White Shadow in the breezy plains and promised to give Wilkinson a higher position than he had now if he were to join the White Shadow. Of course, Gadget was not planning to give his position to Wilkinson. In fact, despite their extremely high status, unlike archmages and level 16 or 17 warriors, pharmacists could not pose a threat to a leader even though they had a great influence. The greatest concern for leaders during recruitment was the fear of getting replaced by powerful combatants. As for pharmacists? No way. After Gadget had finished speaking, he looked at Wilkinson with anticipation, feeling his heart pounding rapidly in his chest as if it was about to jump out of his throat. Silence filled the air in the hall. Everyone was waiting to hear Wilkinson's answer with complex emotions. They hoped that he could answer straightforwardly, but at the same time, they also didn't want to see the White Shadow gaining an advantage. "What for?" "I don't have the time," Wilkinson answered without hesitation. "What a joke. I'm receiving guidance from Master Felix here. What can I do over at your place? I might as well return to Alana." Gadget was dumbfounded, and he began to wonder if his words were too vague for Wilkinson's comprehension. "Mr. Pharmacist, what I meant was, I hope that we can receive your help. I promise you'll definitely make great progress in the White Shadow and we'll provide the best resources for you." "You?" Wilkinson scanned Gadget from head to toe condescendingly before continuing in a hostile manner, "The White Shadow? Who do you think you are?" Before giving Gadget the chance to even speak, he turned around and left the hall. Was that it? Gadget stood rooted to the ground in shock while a ringing sound formed in his ears. He felt like his soul had left his body, and he suddenly couldn't sense anything. After seeing what had happened, the people of the other forces had no idea if they should be happy or worried themselves. Should we continue to send the gifts? Was it really possible that these pharmacists would be recruited by their own forces? Every gift cost a significant amount of money. If their efforts were to be in vain, it would be a huge loss for all of them. Gadget snapped back to reality, and said to his subordinates, Seems like we're not showing enough sincerity. Yes, the rejection faced by the White Shadow does not mean that we won't succeed in soliciting some pharmacists. Their sincerity has not moved that pharmacist, but we can show more sincerity than they did. Regardless of the purpose of Gadget's words, those people whose faith had been somewhat shaken once again grew determined to poach some pharmacists. Besides, they couldn't quit at this point. After all, they had invested so much into the plan, and would have nothing left if they were to give up. It was a gamble where one would be eager to recoup their losses, because leaving would mean losing everything for good. Master Felix, this is a set of test tubes they just sent that are made of crystal of clear skies. I think you're the only person eligible to use it. Wilkinson, who had been treating the gift givers hostilely in the hall just now, gazed at the test tubes in awe and handed them to Lin Li. Lin Li reached out and took out a test tube from the wooden box nonchalantly before staring at it beneath the sunlight. He then put it back again while saying, "Yes, it's made of crystal of clear skies, but the craftsmanship is inferior. Leave it behind for a while. I'll help you fix it." As a master of working with gems and diamonds, the test tubes indeed weren't too attractive to him. At first, Wilkinson thought that Lin Li was embarrassed to accept his gift, and thus said that he would fix it. However, not long after, he knew that every word Lin Li said was true when he saw a pristine test tube placed in front of him. The gift-giving went on, and the forces were continuously expressing their sincerity, after which they were faced with various obstacles. However, not everyone returned empty-handed. It was said that the head of a small group of mercenary corps called the Red Army had sent several less hefty gifts, and did not request any pharmacist to join his army. Instead, he asked for 2 potions that would help with strengthening combat energy. With the help of Yuan Li elixir, both the father and the son broke through after plateauing in their combat energy practice and became level 15 warriors. For a small mercenary group that only consisted of hundreds of people and had a low status in the breezy plains, the appearance of 2 level 15 warriors was equivalent to the strength of the entire mercenary group, increasing several times over. However, such gains did not mean much to the middle-class forces, for all they were coveting was the chance to recruit a pharmacist. Gadget, the leader of the White Shadow, had been mercilessly rejected. However, despite the lesson he'd got, he was still as eager about recruiting the pharmacists. In the eyes of those forces, the failure of the White Shadow was because of overeagerness and a lack of sincerity. They believed that they would one day be able to convince the pharmacists as long as they expressed enough sincerity. While the forces and factions of the breezy plains were dreaming about recruiting the pharmacists, the Tower of Dusk was using them to make a fortune. Under Lin Li's training, the bunch of young pharmacists advanced to senior pharmacist level, and although they were not exactly experienced veterans, they could be said to be familiar with concocting potions for sale and were highly efficient. The pharmaceutical business of the Glitter Gold Trade Union and Gilded Rose had been facing issues regarding Lin Li's supply due to the fact that they had a huge sales network throughout the entire Felon. Although it was said that things became more precious and valuable when they were scarce, there was still a limit. Things that were worth 10 yuan might be sold for 1,000 yuan based on scarcity. However, it would be extortion if they were sold for 100,000 yuan. Absurdly high prices would just mar the reputation of the seller's entire business. However, if prices were kept within the acceptable range, the items would often sell out too quickly, and there would then be a deficit in supply of goods. When demand outweighed supply, the business would be blamed for incompetence. However, the leaders of the 2 trade unions could finally heave a sigh of relief, because the production capacity and volume of the pharmacy of the Tower of Dusk had been greatly improved. It could now entirely fulfill the demand of the 2 trade unions. Under the operation of the 2 largest trade unions in the 2 Felon kingdoms, the prices of medicine and potions had not decreased too drastically despite the increased production, thus maximizing the benefits. As the supplier of the 2 trade unions, the position held by the Tower of Dusk in this partnership could not be compared to that of ordinary suppliers. The leaders of the 2 trade unions also knew that if they were to leave the Tower of Dusk, even the Pharmacist Guild would not be able to provide so many high-quality potions. Hence, they took the initiative to make a huge compromise in the collection of revenue from pharmaceutical sales, even though Lin Li didn't mention anything. While business was at its peak in the Tower of Dusk, the manager of the Rosen Union of Duland was feeling smug about his decision. Although the Rosen Union had claimed to control more than 80% of the ore transactions in Duland at the beginning, it was in fact only because of the low profit of the ore transaction and the many other miscellaneous and trivial matters that the other forces could not be bothered to vie with them. Even the retarded son of the leader of Duland City could reprimand Come On, the president, like a dog, let alone the rest of the breezy plains. However, things were different now. Ever since Kaman had sucked up to the young president of the Tower of Dusk, sucked up. Kaman didn't dislike the term at all, because others might not even get the chance to do so. Those fools who'd tried desperately failed because they aimed for the wrong target, and choosing the wrong target resulted in a waste of efforts. He seemed to have struck a huge fortune, for the distributorship of magical equipment had brought him a ton of profits. Now, the weapons and equipment partnership with the Tower of Dusk had begun to take off and was on a good track. Who would have thought that the Rosen Union, which did not have a great reputation in Duland, had now already established enough capital that would allow them to go against the Blacksmith Guild? This did not only bring about monetary changes, it also gave Kaman a better reputation in Duland City and the Breezy Plains. Although Kaman was known as the Tyrant of Duland, he'd not even been qualified to speak in front of Lord Anjai of Duland in the past. But now, Anjai would definitely send him an invitation to every banquet he held without fail. They were almost like brothers. Kaman knew who the person who'd given him all of this was. Hence, despite being a money grubber, he dared not be greedy at all during the cooperation with the Tower of Dusk. He knew very well that the young President Felik was not as difficult to serve and please as other nobles. As long as Kaman was willing to do things seriously, he would definitely stand to gain some benefits without having to use any tricks. Although Lin Li dealt in the weapons and equipment business, he did not come up with a blacksmith training course. However, that did not affect the development of the business. Although smithing masters and gurus were rare finds in the blacksmithing industry, there were far more intermediate and advanced smiths than pharmacists. Moreover, unlike potions, magic weapons and equipment were not consumables. When a sophisticated magical weapon and equipment was in the hands of those who knew how to maintain it, it could practically remain pristine for the rest of the wielder's life. Therefore, compared to potions, there was a lower demand for magical weapons and equipment. Given the abilities of smithing masters, they could create one piece at a time without wasting too much time. Jirian claimed to be here for free food, but in fact, he barely enjoyed a few days of real leisure. First, he spent more than 2 months fighting the Sire bandits in the Dragon Mountains, after which he headed back to Alana to help Lin Li find the pharmacists. After sending the pharmacists to the Tower of Dusk, he took a break for 2 days before going to the Manhwa family again to discuss the pharmacy partnership. Lin Li was very grateful to Jirian, the fat old man who had a bitchy character. Although he had never mentioned it explicitly, he was well aware that Jirian was the only other person in Anril who genuinely cared about him apart from his teacher Andoin. Jirian cared about him in a different way from Andoin, though. He was more like a big brother to Lin Li. Although he was not very competent or capable, he was genuinely concerned about him. Lin Li felt a sense of urgency and anticipation regarding the calamity that was about to happen soon. If he were lucky, he would be able to acquire some extraordinary medicinal materials from the magical beasts. Arcane potions had the ability to promote mage apprentices to mages, while mysterious potions could promote mages to magic shooters, and rune potions could promote magic shooters to archmages. Did that mean that there was a potion that could promote an archmage to a legendary mage? There was no answer to this question in the world of Anril, for everyone would think that it was a question that only lunatics would ask. However, as a master of pharmacy, Lin Li knew very well that although pharmacy was not invincible, it could make many impossibilities come true. With Jirian's potential, he would at most remain an archmage, and it would be impossible for him to reach the legendary realm. Although the lifespan of an archmage had been greatly extended, it was far from that of a legendary mage. Hence, Lin Li hoped to help Jirian enter the legendary realm as far as possible. Whenever someone treated Lin Li genuinely well, he would do his best to treat them well too. Of course, it was still too early to be talking about it. After all, Lin Li might not be able to concoct an extraordinary potion with his current abilities. However, Jirian had never once complained about the hassle of having to travel around after he returned from the visit to the Manhwa family. Instead, he told Lin Li excitedly about the superior treatment that he received as well as how he made the Manhwa family abandon their pride and give in. After the operation to annihilate the Sire bandits ended, Hutton acquired plenty of loot. After all, the sire bandits were rather powerful and wealthy since they had seized the assets of plenty of tycoons in the breezy plains over the years. The elders of the Manhwa family did not object to the cooperation after seeing the loot that he had brought home, and also began to grow less hostile towards the newly established Tower of Dusk. Jirian visited the Manhwa family as the messenger of the Tower of the Dusk. Hun knew the importance of this fat man in Lin Li's heart. They could not afford to make any mistakes at all, especially during this cooperation which mattered greatly to the family. Hence, he informed his family not to act rashly right from the start. He even locked his younger brother Harvey up for a few days. Jirian and the Manhwa family held harmonious negotiations and successfully finalized all the details of the cooperation. The Manhwa family did not harp on a minor profit, and Jirian wasn't unreasonable and wouldn't compromise Lin Li's interests for the sake of his own joy. Those business gains were enough to ensure that the Tower of Dusk would maintain a stable and big momentum of development in the future. However, Lin Li still had higher requirements for the Tower of Dusk, which seemed to involve a crazy design. He hoped that the completed Tower of Dusk would not be a simple shelter for the mages that would shield them from the wind and rain, but also a sanctuary that could stand strong even during the worst disaster in the world. It was absolutely a crazy idea. Even legendary realm powerhouses might fall during the incoming calamity, and even the sacred sanctuary realm ones might not be able to fend for themselves easily. The Darkness Shrine, which had once been as strong as the Brilliance Shrine, was severely damaged by the magical beasts. This time, the imminent calamity was going to be far larger than the previous one, and it was very likely to destroy the entire Anril. Hence, in order to create a sanctuary and place of refuge for the world, he had to be prepared to face the impact of the powerful magical beasts, something that perhaps only the High Elves with their sky castles could do. Everyone would probably think that Lin Li was being crazy and delusional, but he was well aware that it was possible for him to realize his plans with the resources he now had. Although the pharmaceutical and weaponry business could continue to bring a lot of benefits, it could only help slowly complete the construction of the Tower of Dusk in a cumulative manner. Even if it took a century to build the Tower of Dusk into what Lin Li wanted, it would seem like an absolutely short period of time to others. However, Lin Li knew that there was only 2 or 3 years left for him to prepare for the calamity. If construction could not be completed before the disaster, everything would be a waste of effort. Hence, it all seemed too slow to Lin Li, be it 100 years or 5 to 10. Fortunately, the benefits that Lin Li had reaped recently were far beyond imagination, and he finally had the time to organize his loot. During the trip to the Abyss of Tharlan, Lin Li had not only broken into the legendary realm, he also directly encroached the home of the Lord of Darkness, and took the Throne of Darkness, created by the Dragon of Destruction. However, what he had to sort out now was not the Darkness domain, but the accumulation of resources collected by the Lord of Darkness over millions of years. The Lord of Darkness was the ruler of the Abyss of Tharlan, and naturally accumulated a ton of resources over millions of years, but they were also limited by the environment. Among the resources were various magic crystals as well as the medicinal materials and minerals produced by the Abyss. There were not too many magical weapons and other pieces of magical equipment, and most of them were in horrible condition. The medicinal materials and minerals produced by the Abyss each had their own uses, and could not be immediately exchanged for large sums of money. On the other hand, there was only a very small amount of gold and silver that were often present when it came to treasures. After all, in the Endless Abyss, there wasn't a complete economic system like that of Anril. Those demons had no choice but to resort to bartering for what they wanted. A large number of magic crystals could be exchanged for money, but Lin Li needed the magical crystals desperately at this moment. The original Lord of Nightmares in the summoning lamp was like a vortex that sucked in endless amounts of magical crystals. Besides, he would require legendary magical crystals in order to hatch the Dragon of Destruction's descendant. Moreover, the Tower of the Dusk would be equipped with magical crystal cannons in the future, hence, magical crystals were equivalent to ammunition reserves that couldn't be sold. Next, it would be the loot that he had obtained from the Sire Bandits. Unfortunately, Lin Li had not taken the gold coins and gemstones into consideration when splitting the loot with Hutton back then, and instead chose raw materials and various semi-finished products. If he wanted to convert the raw materials and semi-finished products into funds, they had to be processed into finished products and then sold through a proper sales channel. The entire process was rather slow. However, that was not all that Lin Li had gained. Not to forget, he had also acquired a massive amount of treasures and gems from the underground palace, most of which could be exchanged for a large amount of money. In the era of the High Elves, there was already a complete currency system. In addition to the value of precious metals themselves, exquisite elven-style gold and silver coins were still artwork quite widely sought after. Except for the coins from the Elven era, all kinds of Elven-style weapons and equipment, as well as Elven-style furniture and accessories, were absolutely valuable, as with all other elf-related items. The Elven-era items acquired in the underground palace, which were once considered to be useless by Lin Li, were actually enough to give him a large amount of money for the construction of the Tower of Dusk alone. The construction of the Tower of Dusk would be a great improvement for the mages of the Guild of Magic in terms of abilities, on top of providing better facilities. Although Lin Li had a rune potion that could forcibly help an archmage advance, he still had to consider the interest of the Tower of Dusk when selecting someone to use the potion on. The topic was inevitably related to the majordomo of the Tower of Dusk, Gavin. His management abilities were so superb that even Jirian, who had been a president for years, took his hat off to him. As for ambition, Lin Li had never worried about it ever since he delegated the management of the tower to Gavin. Only the useless and incompetent ones would worry about their subordinates posing a threat to their status and betraying them, thus resulting in irreparable damage to themselves. Those were the kind of people who would use various excuses to limit the performance of their subordinates. Gavin's performance also gained him Lin Li's trust. He had efficiently used the massive amount of operating funds and turned them into a powerful driving force for the development of the Tower of Dusk. More and more mages, including those outside the breezy plains, were attracted to the Tower of Dusk, which provided splendid accommodation and offered great benefits. Of course, the generous treatment was not just for anyone who came. In order to tackle this issue, Gavin had initiated the contribution system where only the mages who had contributed significantly to the Tower of Dusk and the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic could enjoy the treatment they deserved after accumulating a certain contribution value. The system did not scare away the mages who were interested in joining, because the requirements were not an issue at all when compared to the huge benefits that were being offered. Some of them had calculated it carefully, and finally came to the conclusion that with the abilities of an average mage, they would enjoy better treatment than archmages of other forces did, as long as they were not lazy in contributing and were serious about their work. Magic equipment, magic accessories, and even expensive potions all had to be exchanged using contribution values in an open and fair manner so that no one had to worry about fairness and the issue of prejudice. They didn't have to push beyond their limits at all. Instead, they just had to perform their duties well, and they would enjoy generous treatment that they couldn't get elsewhere. How enviable! The magicians of the other forces were full of grief and indignation as they thought to themselves, why wasn't the Tower of Dusk established sooner? Although not all loyal retainers would serve just one master in this world, going back on one's word would give them a bad reputation and cause them to become outcasts. In addition to providing members with generous treatment, the massive wealth that Lin Li had also enabled the construction of various magic facilities and continuous transport of various rare materials to the Tower of Dusk in large quantities. The plan was coming to fruition according to Lin Li's ideas, and Lin Li's intention to purchase magic crystal cannons had also been put on the agenda. The wealthy Tower of Dusk planned to purchase more than 20 of those expensive weapons, which were not common even in the defense systems of some large cities. There were only 18 of them even in the Dwarf Kingdom. In fact, with the current financial resources of the Tower of Dusk, it was not a problem for them to buy twice as many magical crystal cannons even though their price was exorbitant. The problem was that the magical crystal cannons were not swords, after all, and the Dwarf Kingdom's cannon production was limited, which was very much to Lin Li's dismay. However, it didn't matter at all. It was a part of Lin Li's plan to go to the Dwarf Kingdom himself one day because he still held a long-lost blueprint of Skybreaker, which used to belong to the Dwarf Kingdom. As long as he had the blueprint, he would be able to make the craftsman of the dwarf kingdom create the magic weapon which once shot down a sky castle. Yes, the design of the Tower of Dusk was now rather similar and close to Lin Li's ideal one, and it was no longer a simple tower for mages. It had 10 sides of defense, legendary magical crystal powering it, and countless mage wealth arrays. It was a magic fortress that'd definitely be daunting to enemies. With such a defensive force alone, Lin Li was confident that he could easily defeat his foes and render them helpless even if he was to face attacks from the stronger ones at the legendary realm. However, once the 20 or so magical crystal cannons purchased from the dwarf kingdom were in place, it would be a piece of cake for them to deal with the enemies as long as there were less than 10 of them. However, those were not the limits of the Tower of Dusk. Not to forget, Lin Li still had a trump card. Once the time was right, he would be able to summon the eternal furnace from the cracks in space, which had been combined with the darkness domain and the fire and ice elements. By then, the Tower of Dusk would truly be worthy of being deemed formidable. The rapid and successful development of the Tower of Dusk had given Lin Li a lot of confidence in dealing with the impending calamity. At the end of yet another lecture, Lin Li caught sight of Alan striding towards him from the other end of the corridor as soon as he exited the pharmaceutical lab. Lin Li waved and gestured for the pharmacists who had walked him to the door to leave. He then turned around calmly and asked Alan, "Alan, what's the matter? Why are you so anxious?" "Master Felix." Alan bowed and stood up straight before continuing, "Master Felix, Mr. William from the time consignment store would like to see you. He's waiting for you in the parlor now. Would you like to see him?" Alan was now a level 16 archmage. When he first arrived in the Tower of Dusk, because of his teacher Basil's request, he did not take the Guild of Magic seriously. However, to his surprise, the young President Felix actually used a seemingly plain method to help him overcome the problem that had troubled him for many years, and gave him hope for promotion to an archmage. However, that incident only made Alan grateful to the young President Felix. What really convinced him was when he saw the young Felix exert his legendary realm power at the mere age of 20 in the Dragon Mountains with his own eyes. Actually, Alan was not alone in that. From then on, everyone in the Tower of Dusk changed their opinion of the young legendary mage of a president, whom they genuinely admired now. "Time consignment store?" Lin Li asked with a frown, finding the name very familiar. However, Alan misunderstood his frown, and quickly said, "Master, if you don't want to see him, I'll send him away." Although Alan had a high status in the breezy plains, he was second to the legendary mage President Felix. "Wait, I remember it now." Lin Li suddenly stopped Alan. He finally remembered that he had once bought a pair of daggers, which were said to be weapons used by the legendary assassin Haller for Norfeller at the time consignment store. As for that Mr. William, he also remembered that the two of them had had a brief conversation at the banquet held by the Castellan of Roland City. Although they had only met each other once, Lin Li had a good impression of the old man. William did not speak to him condescendingly just because he was older, unlike some other elderly men. "I'll go see him." "I don't have anything on anyway," said Lin Li. Since William didn't come to give a gift to the pharmacists, he was allowed to enter the formal parlor. He was awestruck by the beautiful and exquisite elven furnishings around him, and sat on an elven-style wooden chair. William got to where he was today all thanks to his eyes and his knowledge regarding authentication and appraisal. However, he began to doubt his eyes now that he was staring at the beautiful elven-style furniture. Such complete elven-style furniture was almost non-existent nowadays, and was something that money could not buy. How could it be so casually placed in the living room? Well, unless it was all just replicas. However, even perfect replicas could not fool him. William obviously had no idea that Lin Li had looted a lot of Elven-era furniture from Osric's underground palace. To him, those flashy and fancy items were nothing too precious, so the beautiful elven-style furniture that normally was a rare find had all become ornaments and furniture that could be seen everywhere in the Tower of Dusk. "Mr. William, is our furniture easy on the eyes for you?" William finally snapped out of his trance after hearing a young mage's voice. He stood up and got a great shock, because he found the young mage rather familiar. He thought, isn't he that young chap who spoke to me about adamantine of bad luck at the banquet held by the Castellan of Roland City previously? Mr. William, didn't you ask to see our president? Alan prompted. Oh, yes, you. I'm really sorry, but I didn't expect that you'd be the president of this place. I've heard that the president of the Tower of Dusk was a young and powerful mage, but I never expected that we've met before. William recovered from his shock and quickly apologized for his rudeness. Haha, young and promising, is that what they say about me? Mr. William, please have a seat. Lin Li smiled and stretched his hand out to gesture for William to sit while he walked towards the host's main seat together with Alan. Mr. William, did you return from Roland City? I've long heard that the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic was established in Doolin City, but I haven't had the time to come and pay you a visit. Please don't hold it against me, President Fellick, William said with a calm expression, though he felt rather fortunate deep down. He was thankful that he had not disrespected the young mage Fellick during the banquet held by the leader of the Doolin City back then. Otherwise, he might not be able to achieve his goals this time. You're being too polite, Mr. William. It was my fault for failing to consider it properly. After all, the guild has just been established. I didn't send any invitations, because I didn't want to disturb anyone. Of course, Lin Li was just making a casual remark. Even if he were to send out invitations, there would barely be anyone willing to turn up. Well, there hasn't been a guild of magic here for many years. The establishment of the Tower of Dusk is something worth celebrating for the mages here too, I believe. Although William sounded polite on the surface, he was trying to figure out how he could ask about something that he wanted to know. He didn't come to have a chat with President Fellick. However, it'd be inappropriate for him to make his intentions clear before finding out what he wanted to know. The guild has just been established. It's not as influential as you make it out to be. If it weren't for Mr. Basil's help, I'm afraid I'd be the only one here now, Lin Li said modestly. Upon hearing Lin Li mention Basil, William frowned, and asked in shock, you know Mr. Basil too? William obviously knew about Basil. Before the Guild of Magic in the Breezy Plains was established, Basil's library was like a guild of magic in the eyes of the mages. Although Basil was just a librarian, he was said to be a legendary mage. Yet, young Master Fellick has actually gotten acquainted with the legendary mage? Yeah. Lin Li nodded, and decided not to talk about Basil any further. Seeing that Lin Li did not seem interested in talking about Basil, William decided to change the subject, especially since the matter didn't have anything to do with him and his agenda. Young Master Fellick, it's very crowded here. I got a great shock when I arrived. In the past, Lin Li would have really continued beating around the bush with him, but he did not have the time to do so now. He knocked his fingers against the table gently, and half-jokingly said, Mr. William, do you have the same agenda as those people out there? Upon hearing Lin Li's words, William smiled. Good eyesight was the means of living for an appraiser. Although he didn't know how the pharmacists were related to the young president, he could tell from various signs that it was not easy to poach them. Those who tried would probably not have their wishes granted even after going bankrupt. William stared at Lin Li smilingly, and asked, what's the matter? Is young Master Fellick that confident? I'm sure you know better than me how important senior pharmacists are to a force. Aren't you worried about those people out there at all? This is not a prison. Everyone here is free to go where they want to. If they can get what they want, it just means that they're capable enough. Unfortunately, I haven't seen any successful cases yet. Perhaps you might be the first to succeed, Mr. William, Lin Li said with a calm smile, seemingly not bothered by the fact that someone else was trying to poach his pharmacists. William began to feel more and more confused as he wondered to himself just why Lin Li was so confident about it. Human character was the hardest thing to grasp in this world. What made him think that those pharmacists were fools? Or was he really not restricting the freedom of those pharmacists, and was simply letting them do as they pleased? It would be impossible not to be tempted by the 20-odd pharmacists who had just appeared in the Tower of Dusk. Although William's most famous business was the time consignment store, he was actually involved in other industries, especially the pharmaceutical one. It was a lucrative industry, and some people who had the ability and connections could not resist the temptation of making profits. William was not blinded by temptation, however. Although the news of these senior pharmacists was spreading like wildfire in the breezy plains and causing a major uproar, the forces participating in the pursuit were working extremely hard as if they would be able to solicit success at any time as long as they worked hard. If it were really that easy to recruit the pharmacists, it wouldn't be up to them to do it. The Manhwa family would have long brought them to Manhwa. No one in the breezy plains would have the audacity to say that they were much stronger than the Manhwa family, and no one could compare to the Glitter Gold Trade Union in terms of wealth. They were all just dreaming. Besides, there were many powerful forces in this world, and the Manhwa family was only dominating Manhwa. Since when was it their turn to poach the pharmacists, especially when the Glitter Gold Trade Union didn't even dare to claim to be the richest in the world? His subordinates had repeatedly suggested and proposed that they recruit a few senior pharmacists before the rest did, but they were all turned down by the decisive William, who had seen through everything clearly right from the start. Most of the gifts given by the forces to the pharmacists were acquired from the time consignment store. However, William's sharp senses told him to forego the benefits despite them being placed right in front of him. Although William refused to participate in recruiting pharmacists, it did not mean that he had given up the pursuit of benefits. There were many ways to obtain benefits, and it was not necessary for him to make the pharmacists his own. Many people looked down on Ona's mercenary corps because they were too insignificant in the breezy plains. Such a small mercenary group that could not even be considered a faction actually had the cheek to go to the pharmacists and present them with gifts, hoping to get into their good books. They were just overestimating their own abilities. Even if Ona had obtained a potion that allowed his and his son's strength to advance to level 15, they were still considered embarrassing and unworthy to the other forces. However, if everyone's efforts and gains were compared to each other, Ona would be the one who really stood to gain. Although Ona used the potion to break through to level 15, it was far more valuable than the gifts that Ona had given away. Besides, had Ona only gained some benefits in terms of personal strength? Although the warriors who had broken through to level 15 would still be very different from the archmages in terms of strength, the extension of their lifespan was almost the same. For a small group of mercenary corps, having 2 level 15 warriors was almost equivalent to doubling their strength, which meant that there would be more opportunities for them to obtain more benefits. However, it was just a potion that was casually concocted during an experiment, though it was life-changing for some. That was also the reason for the pharmacist's superior status. William's agenda this time was not to hire the pharmacists or discuss partnership with Lin Li. Instead, it was for something else. However, before he broached the topic, he would still have to find out what was the relationship between the Tower of Dusk and the senior pharmacists. Ripples formed in William's heart, and he tried to think of an appropriate way to pose his question. If he were too careless with his words, he might end up offending Lin Li. At this very moment, the door of the hall was suddenly opened, and a youth who was dressed in a pharmacist's coat poked his head through the crack. He seemed to have something to say to Lin Li. "Oh, Wilkinson, is there a problem?" "Come on in," Lin Li said smilingly while waving at Wilkinson. Lin Li was being a little disrespectful by allowing his subordinate to interrupt the meeting with a guest. However, William did not feel in the least bit displeased. Because he had heard of Wilkinson before. Hence, he knew that he was the most important among the batch of senior pharmacists. William was tempted because he felt that he might be able to find out about the pharmacist's relationship with the Tower of Dusk from Wilkinson. "Mr. Pharmacist, it's my honor to be able to see you here," William said as he stood up while Wilkinson walked towards them. However, Wilkinson ignored William and instead glanced at Lin Li inquisitively. "This is the owner of the time consignment store, Mr. William. We've met once before," Lin Li introduced. "Oh," Wilkinson said while scanning William from head to toe condescendingly without saying anything else. Since Lin Li said that they had only met once, Wilkinson's glance was enough. "Wilkinson, if there's nothing too important or urgent, take a seat and wait for me there. Mr. William hasn't told me about the purpose of his visit yet." Lin Li pointed at the chair beside him and poked fun at William. Wilkinson did not say much, and instead took a seat while staring at the old man William with displeasure. Feeling extremely awkward, William began sweating, and droplets of sweat trickled down from his forehead. However, there was nothing he could do, since he was the one asking for a favor. Besides, he was at fault for beating around the bush. He smiled awkwardly while seated on the chair, knowing that there was no point in saying anything more. The young president would probably flare up and lose his patience if he were to continue saying some nonsense. "Please forgive me, President Felix. I do need your help this time," William said earnestly. Actually, there was no need for him to try and find out anything more at this point. Wilkinson's attitude towards Lin Li had already spoken for itself. "Mr. William, you don't have to do this. I can't guarantee that I can help you for sure. What exactly is the matter? Feel free to tell me about it." Actually, Lin Li could already tell that William was there for the pharmacists. "Well, because I run the time consignment store, I often get the chance to get in touch with peculiar and strange things. It was also through a very accidental opportunity where I acquired several potion formulae from the Dark Age from an adventurer," William said as he stared at Wilkinson, who was sitting opposite him. Wilkinson's eyes lit up as he heard William talk about the formulae of the potions from the Dark Age. For a pharmacist, nothing was more attractive than a pharmaceutical formula, especially one from the Dark Age when the war that swept the entire Amril occurred, bringing huge damage to pharmaceutics-related legacies. Many formulae and pharmaceutical techniques were lost then. Sensing the change in Wilkinson's attitude, William silently heaved a sigh of relief. As long as he could pique Wilkinson's interest, he would have a shot at it. In fact, the real reason for his visit at the Tower of Dusk was not to meet Lin Li or Wilkinson. Just as William had said earlier, he happened to get some formulae from an adventurer by chance. Although he could tell from the formulae that they were really from the Dark Age, he could not understand them. William also ran a pharmaceutical business. Although he was not involved in pharmacy, he knew that if those formulae were genuine, they would be priceless. Thank you for watching Mystic Realms Recap. Please like, share and subscribe. Have a great day.